The town of Hollow Creek had exactly one diner worth mentioning, and on Sunday mornings, it filled with the same crowd it always had. Contractors nursing coffee before a long day, retired schoolteachers splitting a stack of pancakes, and the Whitfield family, who occupied the corner booth every week like it had their name engraved on it. Marigold Thistlewood didn't belong to that crowd. She sat 2 booths down with her husband, Callahan Ash, a quiet man with grease-stained knuckles and a faded flannel shirt that had seen better decades. Outside, parked crooked in the gravel lot, sat his truck, a 1987 Ford with a bed full of rust holes, a passenger door that didn't quite close right, and a paint job that had faded from red to the color of dried clay. It wasn't a truck people admired. It was a truck people laughed at. "Would you look at that thing?" said Reginald Whitfield, loud enough to carry, as he glanced out the window at the rust-eaten Ford. Reginald ran the town's largest real estate brokerage, and he wore that fact the way some men wear cologne: heavy, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. "I think that truck qualifies as a hazard. Somebody should report it to the county." His wife, Carlotta, tittered into her coffee. "Maybe he's saving up for a new one. Some men just don't have the means." Marigold felt her jaw tighten, but Callahan didn't so much as look up from his eggs. He never did. In 11 years of marriage, she had rarely seen him rattled by other people's opinions of him, and this morning was no exception. He ate slowly, methodically, like a man with nowhere he needed to prove himself to. "That's the trouble with some folks," Reginald went on, not quite whispering. "They'd rather look poor than admit they can't afford better. I always say a man's vehicle tells you everything about his bank account." Marigold set down her fork. "Reginald, no offense meant, of course," he said, holding up both hands with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent 20 years saying offensive things and calling them observations. Just an observation. The diner had gone quiet in that particular way. Small-town diners go quiet, not silent, but attentive, every ear tuned toward the exchange, while every set of eyes pretended to study a menu or a coffee cup. Callahan finally looked up. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. "It runs fine," he said simply, and went back to his eggs. Reginald smiled, the smile of a man who believed he'd already won. "I'm sure it does." For now, Nadja Ferris had waited tables at the Hollow Creek Diner for 6 years, long enough to know every regular by their order before they sat down, long enough to recognize the particular cruelty that some people mistook for wit. She'd watched Reginald Whitfield needle other customers before. A mechanic, he thought, dressed beneath his station. A young mother he'd once commented on for using coupons in front of him. And she'd always bitten her tongue, because the Whitfields tipped well and complained loudly. And a diner in a town this size couldn't survive on principle alone. But something about the quiet man in the flannel shirt made her want to say something. Maybe it was the way he never rose to the bait. Maybe it was the way his wife's hands had curled into fists under the table. Fists she was too proud to let anyone see. Nadja refilled their coffee without being asked. "Don't mind him," she murmured to Marigold, low enough that only their booth could hear. "He talks like that to everybody. Doesn't mean anything by it." "He means plenty by it," Marigold said quietly. Nadja hesitated, then glanced toward Callahan, who was wiping his mouth with a paper napkin, entirely unbothered. There was something in the set of his shoulders, a stillness. Not the stillness of someone beaten down, but the stillness of someone who simply didn't need the room's approval. She'd seen that kind of calm before, in men who had nothing left to prove. "You two live around here long?" Nadja asked, mostly to change the subject. "About 8 months," Marigold said. "We're still getting settled." "Whereabouts?" Callahan answered, this time, without looking up. "Out past the old grain depot. The property with the long fence line." Nadja blinked. She knew that property. Everyone in Hollow Creek knew that property. Because it wasn't just a house. It was 400 acres that had once belonged to the Calloway family, sold off in pieces over the decades until almost nothing remained but the land itself. Land that had sat fallow and forgotten for the better part of 10 years. Land that, as far as anyone in town understood, had recently been purchased by some out-of-state company nobody had ever heard of. "You're renting out there?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Callahan set down his napkin. "Something like that." The bell over the diner door jingled, and in walked a man Nadja recognized immediately. Desmond Okafor, county records clerk, a fixture at the courthouse for the better part of 2 decades, and a man who took his coffee black and his gossip strong. He spotted Reginald's table and made a beeline for it, practically vibrating with the kind of energy that meant he'd learn something worth sharing. "Reginald," Desmond said, sliding into the booth without invitation. "You're not going to believe what came across my desk yesterday." "Try me." "The Callaway property, the whole 400 acres out past the depot." Desmond leaned in. "Somebody finally filed the deed transfer. Took them long enough. Paperwork's been sitting in escrow for months." Reginald's ears perked up in the way they always did at the mention of land changing hands. Real estate gossip was his native language. "Who bought it?" "I heard it was some agricultural conglomerate out of Denver." "That's the thing," Desmond said, lowering his voice like he was about to deliver the punchline of the century. "It's not a company at all. It's a person. Recorded the deed under his own name, plain as day." "Well, who is it?" Desmond glanced around the diner, the way people do when they're about to say something they know will land like a dropped plate, and his eyes happened to land on the corner booth, on the man in the faded flannel shirt, quietly finishing his coffee. "Callahan Ash," Desmond said. The diner did not go quiet this time. It went dead silent. Reginald turned in his seat so fast his coffee nearly sloshed over the rim of his cup. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Callahan Ash," Desmond repeated, oblivious to the storm he'd just detonated. Or perhaps not oblivious at all. "The whole Callaway spread. 400 acres, the old grain depot included. Recorded under his name 2 days ago. I only remember because it's not every day somebody buys half a township in one signature." Every head in the diner turned toward the corner booth. Callahan didn't flinch. He simply reached for his water glass and took a slow sip, as if the conversation happening 6 feet away had nothing at all to do with him, which, in his mind, it didn't. He'd never asked anyone to be impressed. Marigold, on the other hand, allowed herself the faintest smile. Reginald's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. "That property," he finally managed. "That property has been valued at close to $6 million. The depot alone has commercial rezoning potential. I tried to broker that deal myself 18 months ago, and the sellers wouldn't even return my calls." "They returned mine," Callahan said mildly, folding his napkin into a neat square. "Took about for conversations. People like dealing with someone who doesn't waste their time." Carlotta had gone, the particular shade of pale that comes from realizing you've spent the last 20 minutes insulting a man's truck while he quietly owned more land than your husband had sold in his entire career. We didn't mean anything by the comments about your vehicle," she stammered. "It was only in fun." "I know," Callahan said, and there was no bitterness in it. No triumph either. Just the simple, unhurried honesty of a man who'd heard this kind of thing before and had long since stopped needing it to sting. "I liked the truck. Drove it since I was 22. Man doesn't need a new one just because he can afford it." Reginald, to his credit, seemed to understand the size of the hole he'd dug for himself. "If I'd known." "That's exactly the problem, Reginald," Marigold said. And this time, she didn't bother lowering her voice. "You needed to know. You couldn't just be decent to a stranger on the chance that decency didn't come with a price tag attached." The diner had never been this quiet on a Sunday morning. Not in Nadja's 6 years behind the counter. Every fork had stopped moving. Every conversation had died. Nadja approached the corner booth slowly, coffee pot still in hand, feeling like she was walking towards something she didn't fully understand yet. "Mr. Ash," she said carefully, "I have to ask, is it true about the Callaway land?" Callahan looked up at her. He looked the way he hadn't bothered to look at Reginald all morning, and something in his expression softened. He remembered her. Remembered the coffee refill she hadn't needed to offer. The quiet murmur of "don't mind him." The way she'd treated him like a person before she had any reason to expect anything back. "It's true," he said. "I grew up not far from that land. My grandfather used to work the grain depot before it shut down. Always told me, if I ever had the means, I should buy it back and give it a reason to matter again." "And now you have the means," Nadia said. "Now I have the means." He glanced toward the window, toward the rusted truck sitting crooked in the lot. "Truck got me here just fine, though. Didn't need anything fancier to close on 400 acres. Just needed somebody willing to sign." Nadia laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and for the first time all morning, some of the tension in the room cracked loose. "I'm going to be hiring out at the depot," Callahan added, almost as an afterthought, though Marigold knew it was anything but. Her husband didn't say things by accident. "Restoring the grain elevators, bringing the land back into production. Going to need people who know the area. People who show up early and don't complain about the work." Nadia's breath caught. "I've got a cousin who used to work grain elevators before the depot closed. Lost his job when it shut down. Been driving 40 minutes each way to find shift work ever since." "Have him come by Monday," Callahan said. "Tell him to ask for me directly." Reginald sat frozen in his booth, his coffee gone cold, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. He'd spent the better part of 20 years believing that wealth wore a particular uniform, a certain car, a certain watch, a certain way of walking into a room and demanding it notice you. He'd never once considered that it might look like a man in a flannel shirt, eating eggs quietly in a corner booth, driving a truck held together with rust and stubbornness. "Mr. Ash," Reginald said, his voice smaller than it had been all morning, "if you're looking to develop the depot property, I'd be happy to discuss representation. I know the zoning boards, I know the—" "I'm sure you do," Callahan said, standing and pulling a few bills from his wallet to cover the check, plus a tip that made Nadia's eyes widen. "But I think I'll manage this one myself. Wouldn't want you wasting your time on somebody who drives a truck like mine." He didn't say it unkindly. He didn't need to. The words landed exactly as heavy as they were meant to, and Reginald absorbed them with the particular defeat of a man realizing, all at once, that the story he'd been telling himself about who deserved respect had been wrong the entire time. Marigold slid out of the booth beside her husband, tucking her arm through his. As they walked toward the door, she glanced back once at Nadia, who was still standing by their table, coffee pot forgotten in her hand. "Thank you," Marigold said, "for the coffee, and for not needing a reason to be kind." "It's just coffee," Nadia said. "It's never just coffee," Marigold answered. "Not to people who remember who poured it." Outside, the truck coughed to life. On the second try, the way it always did, a sound like an old man clearing his throat before speaking. Callahan backed it carefully out of the gravel lot, past the polished sedans and the newer trucks, belonging to men who had never once had to prove what they were worth, to a room full of strangers. Inside, the diner slowly returned to its Sunday rhythm, forks resuming their work, conversations picking back up, though quieter now, more careful, as if everyone in the room had just been handed a lesson they hadn't asked for and couldn't quite set down. Reginald left without finishing his breakfast. Nadia's cousin started at the depot the following Monday. Within a year, the old grain elevators were running again, painted fresh, humming with the particular energy of a place that had been given a second chance. The town gave the depot a new name eventually. Locals just called it Ash Grain, though Callahan himself never asked for the honor. And every Sunday morning, without fail, the rusted 1987 Ford still rattled into the same gravel lot outside the Hollow Creek Diner, parked crooked between the sedans, because its owner had never seen a reason to trade in something that still ran just fine, and had never once needed anyone's permission to know exactly what he was worth.